It was Thanksgiving Eve, 1971, when a man in a dark suit walked onto a plane under a name that wasn't his own, carrying nothing that gave him away. No weapon anyone could see, no reason for anyone to look twice. By the time that flight landed, he had $200,000 in cash strapped to his body, and somewhere over the black, rain-drowned forests of the Pacific Northwest, he opened a door mid-air and stepped out into the night. No one has seen him since. Not his face, not his body, not so much as a scrap of the parachute he vanished with. Whether he's dead or alive is a question that has outlived nearly everyone who worked the case. The story begins quietly enough, in a way that makes what follows even harder to believe. On November 24, 1971, in Portland, Oregon, a man stepped up to the ticket counter, paid in cash, and gave his name as Dan Cooper. And because this was 1971, because air travel still belonged to a more trusting world, nobody thought to ask him for proof of who he was. He boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305, bound for Seattle, settled into his seat like any other tired traveler, ordered a bourbon and soda, and lit a cigarette. And it was somewhere in that quiet, unremarkable stretch of the flight that he passed a note to the flight attendant beside him. A note that said, in a few plain words, that he was carrying a bomb. He opened his briefcase just enough for her to see it. Wires, red sticks, the shape of something built to be believed. And then came his demands. $200,000 in worn $20 bills, and 4 parachutes, as if he already knew exactly how this story was going to end. The plane touched down in Seattle. The passengers filed off into a night that had no idea what it had just carried. And in their place came the money and the parachutes and an order to take off again. This time toward Mexico City, flying low, flaps down, the rear staircase primed to open on his word alone. Somewhere in the dark corridor of sky between Seattle and Reno, in a driving rainstorm, at 8 o'clock at night, he lowered that staircase, fastened a parachute to his back, and let the night swallow him whole. By every reasonable account, this should have been an easy case to close. Military jets had shadowed that plane through the entire flight, and the FBI knew, down to a fairly narrow stretch of wilderness, almost exactly where he'd gone out the door. So they searched. Week after week, then month after month, then year after year, combing through some of the densest, most unforgiving forest in the country, and finding nothing. No parachute tangled in the trees, no briefcase half buried in the mud, no body ever surfacing to close the file. It was as though the forest itself had simply decided to keep him. Then, 9 years later, in 1980, an 8-year-old boy digging in a sandbar along the Columbia River uncovered something that shouldn't have been there. A decaying bundle of cash, nearly $6,000, its serial numbers matching Cooper's ransom money down to the last digit. To this day, it remains the only physical trace that night ever left behind. And instead of answering the question everyone wanted answered, it only multiplied the possibilities. Did his body wash ashore somewhere no search party ever thought to look? Or did he walk away from that jump alive, leaving pieces of his fortune behind him, like breadcrumbs he never meant to drop? No one has ever been able to say for certain. The first theory is the grimmer one, and for a long time, it was the one most investigators quietly believed, that he never survived the fall at all. Picture it, a night jump, through a rainstorm, into forest so dense it swallows sound. A man dressed not for wilderness survival, but for a boardroom, in a business suit and dress shoes, wearing a parachute never designed for a drop like this one. Most skydivers who've studied the case since believe the odds were simply never in his favor. But the second theory tells a very different story, one where nothing about that night was left to chance. Whoever this man was, he knew commercial aircraft intimately, and he knew specifically that this particular jet had a rear staircase built to open mid-flight. A detail so obscure in 1971 that some investigators still believe it points toward military training or years spent working around aircraft for a living. And so, for more than 4 decades, the FBI chased that possibility through more than 800 suspects, though a handful of names still rise above the rest. there was Richard Floyd McCoy, an Army veteran and a skilled skydiver, who pulled off a hijacking almost identical to Cooper's just months later, and who was ultimately shot dead by the FBI while trying to escape from prison. There was Robert Rackstraw, a former paratrooper with a long criminal record, a man who would go on to fake his own death entirely. And then there was a woman named Marla, who has spent years insisting that her uncle confessed the whole thing to her. At an ordinary family gathering, decades before anyone was willing to take her seriously. Not one of them has ever been confirmed, and not one of them has ever been fully ruled out either. The FBI gave the case a name, NORJAC, short for Northwest Hijacking, and kept that file open for 45 uninterrupted years. Search teams returned to those forests again and again. Divers combed the rivers below. And in the year that followed, more than a dozen copycat hijackers, emboldened by how close this one man had come to simply getting away with it, attempted the same trick for themselves, until the airlines finally redesigned their own planes, specifically to make sure no one ever could again. In 2016, the FBI quietly closed the case for good, not because they had finally solved it, but because there was nothing left to chase. Which is how it remains, to this day, the only hijacking in American aviation history that has never been solved. No one knows, even now, whether D.B. Cooper survived that jump into the dark. No one knows, to this day, who he really was before he stepped onto that plane and became someone else entirely. Somewhere out there, in the forests of Southwest Washington, the truth is either buried beneath decades of rain and undergrowth, or it walked away that night and simply never looked back. If you've got a theory of your own about where he went, I want to hear it. Drop it below. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel.